Welcome to the Winnipeg Free Press Blue Bomber Training Camp Report. I'm Tait alongside Paul Wiecek. Paul, day 2 of main training camp here. Let's get right to business here. We'll look at the offensive side of the ball and some of the key battles. What do you see on the offensive line, particularly at that guard position?
Yeah, exactly. Both the left and right guard in play here. You know, it's interesting. Of course, everybody, Chris Greaves, a reliable starter there for the last couple seasons, and it was sort of his position you would have thought was unimpeachable. But there's been, the Bombers suddenly got a whole lot deeper at the non-import position on the offensive line. And suddenly there's some talk about whether maybe Chris Greaves is the kind of guy the Bombers might be able to move for somebody else if they've got enough depth there. But of course, that's the question. Do they have enough depth there? Patrick Neufeld, Bombers acquired him from the Saskatchewan Roughriders a couple years ago. We still haven't had a real good long look at him. He's been dogged by injuries. Matthias Gosen, the Bombers drafted him last year with their first pick, and the thinking last year was, hey, we're taking Matthias Gosen because we think he can be a starter in 2014. That didn't happen. The question is, can he be a starter this year? And then, of course, the Bombers' first pick this year, Suk Chung, is he a guy who the Bombers again drafted hoping that he can be a starter this year? So you put all those guys, those three unknowns in play, and then you layer on top of that a guy like Chris Greaves, who maybe isn't as secure in his position as you would have thought, and suddenly the offensive line, which is sometimes for your average football fan the most boring position on their football team, is actually one of the most compelling narratives in this training camp, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not just what's happening inside. They went out and spent a lot of money on Stanley Bryant, the left tackle, all-star left tackle, and the other spot, the right tackle spot's going to be American as well. Jace Daniel, Devin Tyler from last year, Mark Dial, they went out and got in free agency. So that's going to be a crazy one too. All across, going to be some changes there, but probably for the better based on what we saw last year. Let's look at the tailback position. Paris Cotton's the incumbent, took over last year from Will Ford, and who else was there?
Nick Grigsby.
Nick Grigsby, sorry, yeah, was leading
ended up playing in the Grey Cup.
And not playing in the
good for
yeah, no kidding. So it's 3 years in a row they've had a different guy lead this team in rushing. It looks like a new guy again this year. Paris Cotton's the incumbent, sort of by name only. Didn't start a whole lot there last year. A lot of names behind him. I guess we shouldn't assume anything because that's one of the most easily replaceable positions in this league.
Yeah, that's just it. I mean, you want to talk about the least job security in Canada. I think it's an import tailback. That's where you're renting a house, not buying one.
Right.
Wherever you are. And they're going to go with an import at that position again. The John Cornishes of the world, of course, the rare non-import starting tailback, a ratio breaker for the Calgary Stampeders. If the Bombers could get their hands on a guy like that, they would have him here in camp. They don't got that guy. Here's what I know about the Bomber tailback position. They got to get a whole lot more yardage in their running game this year than last. Not only did the Bombers give up way too many rushing yards last year, but they married that with the worst kind of combination, which is that they didn't rush enough themselves. They got to get better. Is Paris Cotton the guy? I don't know. Geez, you keep seeing these guys year after year. It's like, hey, Will Ford's going to be our guy, and next thing you know, he's not, and it's Nick Grigsby, and then you thought Nick Grigsby was going to be the guy, and he didn't perform terribly, especially early on last year, and then he's gone. So what I've learned is you don't want to get too attached to your import Bomber tailback because they often aren't here for a very long time.
Let's take a look at the receiving core now. You've got Nick Moore, Clarence Denmark, Rory Kohlert, Julian Fioli-Godino. There's an opening at the one wideout position. Let's talk about Darvin Adams and why they went out and got him in free agency.
Yeah, that was the question, right? I mean, they never really did replace Chris Matthews last year, right? I mean, they had Aaron Kelly in that position. They auditioned a bunch of guys. They didn't get, if you're going to have an import guy out there, you've got to get a guy who's going to have some production. They never really got that last year. So they signed Darvin Adams, and it was interesting, right? Because of all these big free agent signings that the Bombers had in the offseason, Dominic Picard, Dominic Picard, Stanley Bryant, of course, the Mark Dial, all these big guys. The one that was kind of overlooked was Darvin Adams. Nobody really talked about him a whole lot. He's looked pretty good here so far, though. You've seen more of this than I have. Of course, the other kind of guy in play here is Addison Richards, who I understand, and mostly from you, that was just spectacular in rookie camp last week. Unfortunately, Addison Richards missing his second straight practice here. The Bombers sort of touted it yesterday. It was no big deal. He was taking a day off. Well, guess what? Addison Richards is taking another day off. As they say, you can't make the club from the tub, Eddie.
Yep. That's the old Cal Murphy line. It's too bad because he had such a good rookie camp, and you want to compare him against the vets, but it's hard to do that when he's just standing around watching. So a guy to keep an eye on. And they're not going to give up on a guy for missing a couple practices, especially when they draft him so high. One last position. Let's just take a quick look at quarterback. It's a given that Drew Willie's the guy, but what happens behind him on the depth chart?
Well, and that's a good question. And nobody's really talked about this, and I think we'll explore this in the pages of the Free Press as this training camp unfolds. You know what? All's good for this team if Drew Willie stays healthy and he plays 16, 17, 18 games. But the reality is in the CFL, sooner or later your starting quarterback is going to miss a start or two because, boy, those guys take a beating, and that's going to happen this year even with an upgraded Bomber offensive line. The big question is Brian Brome and Robert Marv, who are the number 2 and 3 guys respectively last year for this team, are those guys ready to step up and be the starter for this team if Drew Willie goes down? I'm not convinced they are. What little we saw out of Brian Brome in his only start last year when Drew Willie missed that one game was something less than impressive. I like what Robert Marv has shown in the very few stints that he's had. But boy, Robert Marv doesn't really run an offense, though, it seems. He sort of takes the ball and he runs around in circles and he makes things happen, to his credit. But I don't know that that can be a philosophy to be a starting quarterback in the league. That's a big unknown with this team, and nobody's really talked about it. Everybody's talked about the contract extension and everything else for Drew Willie. Nobody's really talking about, though, hey, what if Drew Willie goes down? Are these guys ready for prime time? I don't know if they are.
Yeah, that's the worst kind of what if for this team, right? That's a big question mark. That's our look at the offense. In the next video report, we'll take a look at the defense and special teams. For Paul Wiecek, I'm Tait. This is the Blue Bomber Report.